Welcome to Sleepy Scrolls Slumber, your personal sanctuary where the wonders of history unfold in whispers. Close your eyes, let the parchment of time unroll, and drift into the amazing world of wonder where every story is a lullaby for the mind. Tonight, we begin. Atlantis, Plato's sunken utopia or mythic mirage. An epic investigation into history's most enduring mystery. Here is a question that should make you uncomfortable. What if everything we have been taught about the rise of civilization is wrong, not slightly off, not missing a few details, wrong in the way that changes everything we think we know about human history, about our ancestors, about the very timeline of how we became who we are? What if the story of human progress, that neat narrative of hunter-gatherers slowly, gradually building toward agriculture, then cities, then writing, then all the rest, what if that story is missing entire chapters? What if there were people before us who had already figured some of this out and then lost it all? That is the question Atlantis forces us to ask. And here is why it matters. For more than 2,000 years, the story of Atlantis has haunted Western imagination. It appears in only two of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. In these texts, Plato describes a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his own time, a place of extraordinary wealth, advanced engineering, and military might that ultimately fell victim to its own hubris and was destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods. Most scholars treat Atlantis as pure fiction, a philosophical allegory Plato invented to illustrate his ideas about ideal governance and the dangers of moral decay. They point out that no ancient source before Plato mentions Atlantis. They note that Plato was a philosopher, not a historian, and that he frequently used myths and allegories to make his points. Case closed, they say. Atlantis never existed, but, and this is a big but, Plato insisted his account was true. He did not present the Atlantis story as a parable. He claimed it came from Solon, one of Athens' greatest statesmen, who heard it from Egyptian priests during his travels to the city of Saya around 590 BCE. Plato even provides specific details: the size of the island, the layout of its capital city, the resources it possessed, the nature of its military forces. These are not the vague brushstrokes of allegory. These are the specific claims of someone describing a real place. So either Plato was lying, which seems uncharacteristic for a philosopher who dedicated his life to pursuing truth, or he genuinely believed the story, which means we have to ask, where did it come from? What could have inspired such a detailed account of a lost civilization? The conventional answer is that Plato drew on cultural memory, stories of the Minoan civilization destroyed by the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE, tales of earthquakes and floods from Greek history, perhaps even garbled accounts of other Mediterranean cultures. Mix these together, amplify the drama, set the whole thing in a mythical past, and you get Atlantis. Problem solved. Except, what if the problem is not solved? What if there is something more here? because here is the thing that keeps me up at night. When you start digging into the archaeology and geology of the period Plato describes, roughly 11,600 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, you find something unsettling. You find evidence of catastrophic climate change. You find proof of rapid sea level rise that would have drowned coastal civilizations in a matter of decades or even years. You find mysterious underwater ruins that no one can fully explain. You find advanced megalithic structures like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built by supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers who should not have had the organization or technology to create them. You find flood myths from cultures all over the world, from Mesopotamia to India to the Americas, describing the same basic story, a great deluge that destroyed an earlier world. And you find yourself wondering, is it really so crazy to think that Plato might have been describing something that actually happened? Now, let me be clear. I am not saying Atlantis existed exactly as Plato described it. I am not saying there was a continent in the Atlantic Ocean that sank beneath the waves. I am not endorsing every wild theory that has been proposed about ancient super civilizations or alien intervention or any of that. What I am saying is this: the more we learn about the end of the Ice Age, the less impossible the core of Plato's story becomes. The dates match, the climatic catastrophe matches, the flood myths match. And if you allow yourself to consider, just consider, the possibility that some advanced coastal civilization existed before the deluge and was largely wiped out, leaving only fragments and legends behind, well, suddenly, a lot of mysterious things start making more sense. This is not just about Atlantis. This is about how we think about history itself. For centuries, we have operated under the assumption that human civilization began around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago with the Sumerians and Egyptians. Everything before that was just scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers, right? No cities, no writing, no complex societies. The archaeological records seemed clear, but then we started finding things that did not fit the narrative. Göbekli Tepe, dated to around 9,600 BCE, forces us to rethink what Neolithic people were capable of. Underwater ruins off the coast of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean suggest that rising seas have hidden entire chapters of prehistory from us. Ancient maps like the Piri Reis show coastlines as they would have appeared during the Ice Age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower. Genetic studies reveal population bottlenecks and migrations that correlate with catastrophic climate events at the end of the Pleistocene. The picture that emerges is far more complex and far more interesting than the simple story we were taught in school. So here is what we are going to do. We are going to investigate Atlantis the way a detective investigates a cold case. We are going to look at Plato's original account in detail. We are going to examine the Egyptian connection. We are going to dive into the geology and climate science of the end of the Ice Age. We are going to explore the archaeological evidence for lost civilizations. We are going to consider alternative theories proposed by researchers like Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch. We are going to look at flood myths from around the world and ask what they might preserve. And we are going to do all of this with intellectual honesty, acknowledging what we know, what we do not know, and what remains tantalizingly uncertain. Because whether Atlantis was real or not, the questions it raises are absolutely real. And those questions about lost knowledge, about catastrophe and survival, about how civilizations rise and fall, those are questions that matter, not just for understanding the past, but for understanding where we might be headed. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back to Athens in the 4th century BCE, to an old philosopher telling a strange story about a world that existed long before Greece, before Egypt, before anything we call history. Let us go back to Plato. Chapter 1, Plato's account, a close reading picture. This, Athens, around 360 BCE. Plato is in his 60s, arguably the most influential philosopher in the Western world. He runs the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western tradition. For decades, he has been teaching, writing dialogues, wrestling with questions about justice, truth, the nature of reality. And then he writes 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, that include a story unlike anything else in his work. A story about a lost civilization called Atlantis. Why does this matter? Because Plato is not some medieval chronicler repeating folklore. This is one of the foundational minds of Western philosophy. When he tells a story this specific, this detailed, we have to take it seriously, even if we ultimately conclude it is fiction. We need to understand what kind of fiction it is and what it might be based on. So let us look at exactly what Plato said. The man behind the story, who was Plato? Before we dive into the Atlantis account itself, we need to understand who Plato was and why his testimony matters. This is not just some random ancient writer. This is the student of Socrates, the teacher of Aristotle, a man whose ideas about reality, knowledge, and politics would shape Western thought for the next 2 millennia. Plato was born around 428 BCE into an aristocratic Athenian family. His real name was Aristocles. Plato was a nickname, possibly referring to his broad shoulders or broad forehead. He grew up during the Peloponnesian War, that brutal conflict between Athens and Sparta that would tear the Greek world apart. He witnessed Athens at its height and watched it fall. He saw democracy descend into mob rule. He watched his beloved teacher, Socrates, be executed by the democratic government in 399 BCE. That execution changed Plato forever. It convinced him that societies needed to be governed by wisdom, not by popular opinion. The truth existed independent of what people believed. That philosophy, the love of wisdom, was the only path to understanding reality and creating a just society. After Socrates died, Plato traveled extensively. He visited Italy, Sicily, possibly Egypt, though ancient sources disagree on whether he actually made it to the Nile. Around 387 BCE, he returned to Athens and founded the Academy, a school dedicated to philosophy, mathematics, and the sciences. The Academy would survive for nearly 900 years, making it one of the longest-lasting educational institutions in human history. Plato wrote most of his works in the form of dialogues, conversations between Socrates and various interlocutors, exploring philosophical questions through discussion and debate. He wrote about justice, about knowledge, about love, about the nature of reality itself. His theory of forms, the idea that physical objects are imperfect copies of perfect eternal ideals, would influence philosophy, theology, and science for centuries. This is the man who tells us about Atlantis, not a credulous storyteller, not a fantastist, but a rigorous thinker, a man who dedicated his entire life to distinguishing truth from falsehood, reality from appearance. So when Plato presents the Atlantis story as true, not as allegory, not as myth, but as historical fact passed down through reliable sources, we have to take that claim seriously. We may ultimately disagree with him, but we cannot simply dismiss it. The source, Solon, and the Egyptian priests. The story begins with Critias, a character in the dialogue who claims to be recounting a tale passed down in his family. According to Critias, his great-grandfather heard this story from Solon, one of Athens' legendary lawmakers and poets, who lived around 600 BCE, more than 2 centuries before Plato was born. Now, let us pause here and think about what Plato is doing. He is not saying, "Here is a story I made up." He is not even saying, "Here is a legend I heard." He is providing a specific chain of transmission: Egyptian priests to Solon, to Critias, the elder to Critias, the younger to Plato, to us. This is the move of someone trying to establish credibility, trying to say, this information comes from reliable sources, but who was Solon, and why would Plato invoke his name? Solon was one of the 7 sages of Greece, revered for his wisdom and his reforms of Athenian law. In the early 6th century BCE, Athens was on the brink of civil war. The rich had enslaved many of the poor. Society was fracturing. Solon was given emergency powers to reform the government and prevent collapse. What Solon did was remarkable. He canceled debts, freed those who had been enslaved, reformed the legal code to make it more equitable, and created a government structure that gave citizens a voice while preventing mob rule. He essentially saved Athens from tearing itself apart. After implementing these reforms, Solon did something unexpected. He left Athens. He traveled extensively through the Mediterranean, partly to avoid being pressured to modify his laws, partly out of genuine curiosity. Ancient sources confirm he visited Egypt, meeting with priests and scholars, learning about their culture and history. So, the framework of Plato's story is historically plausible. Solon was real. He did travel to Egypt. He was known for collecting knowledge and stories. The question is, what did he actually hear there? According to Plato, Solon visited the city of Sa in the Nile Delta. There he met with priests who had access to records going back thousands of years. These priests, Plato tells us, mocked Greek historical memory. They told Solon, "You Greeks are children. You have no ancient knowledge, no old tradition. Every time civilization begins to flourish in your land, catastrophe strikes, fire from heaven, floods, plague, and you are thrown back to the beginning. Your myths and legends are like children's stories, preserving only fragments of what really happened. But Egypt, the priests claimed, was different. Protected by the Nile and its cycles, Egyptian civilization had endured for millennia, preserving records of events that other cultures had forgotten. They had maintained an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back into the deep past. And one of those forgotten events was the war between ancient Athens and Atlantis. Think about this from Solon's perspective. You are one of the wisest men in Greece, proud of your culture's achievements, and these Egyptian priests are telling you that Greek civilization is young, that you know nothing of real history, that your ancestors accomplished things you have completely forgotten. That would be humbling. It would also be intriguing. What would you do? You would ask for more. You would want to know what the records said. And according to Plato, that is exactly what Solon did. The priests showed him their records and told him about a time 9,000 years before, around 9500 BCE by our calendar, when Athens was a great power, when its people were virtuous and brave, when it stood against an aggressive empire from the west called Atlantis. The timeline, 9,000 years. Let us stop and think about this date. 9,000 years before Solon would be approximately 9500 BCE. That is 11,500 years ago, more than 7,000 years before the pyramids, more than 6,000 years before the first Sumerian cities. At a time when, according to everything we thought we knew, humans were living in small nomadic bands, hunting and gathering, with no permanent settlements and certainly no capacity for urban civilization or monumental architecture. This is why most mainstream scholars dismiss Atlantis immediately. The timeline simply does not work. Civilization as we understand it, cities, agriculture, writing, complex social hierarchies, did not exist that far back. Therefore, the story must be fiction, case closed. But here is where things start to get interesting. Because while we may not have evidence of full urban civilizations in 9500 BCE, we are finding more and more evidence that our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we once believed. Consider Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which we will explore in depth later. This massive stone complex dates to around 9600 BCE, roughly the same period Plato is talking about. It features elaborately carved pillars weighing many tons, arranged in circular structures that required coordinated labor from hundreds of people. This was not supposed to be possible. Hunter-gatherers were not supposed to have the social organization, the surplus food production, or the motivation to create such structures. And yet, there it is. Or consider the date itself from a geological perspective. 9500 BCE falls right at the end of a period called the Younger Dryas, a time of extraordinary climate upheaval. For 1,200 years, starting around 12,800 years ago, the Earth's climate had been locked in near glacial conditions, even as the Ice Age was supposed to be ending. Then, around 11,600 years ago, temperatures shot up dramatically Within decades, maybe even within years, the world transformed. Sea levels rose rapidly. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years vanished beneath the waves. The megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths went extinct. Human populations crashed in many regions. Entire ways of life became impossible. The date Plato gives us, in other words, corresponds almost exactly to one of the most catastrophic periods in recent geological history. A time when the world was literally being reshaped by forces powerful enough to wipe entire civilizations off the map. Is that a coincidence? Maybe. But it is one hell of a coincidence. Think about it from the Egyptian priests' perspective. They are claiming to have records going back 9,000 years. Is that possible? Well, Egyptian civilization is definitely old. The pyramids were built around 2600 BCE, already ancient by Solon's time, but 9,000 years before Solon. That would be before any known Egyptian dynastic culture. Unless, what if the Egyptian priests were preserving oral traditions that predated their own civilization? What if they were the inheritors of knowledge from even older cultures? This might sound far-fetched, but we know that oral traditions can preserve information for thousands of years. Aboriginal Australians have oral histories describing sea level changes that can be verified geologically and that date back more than 10,000 years. Native American traditions describe volcanic eruptions and landscape changes from similar time depths. If oral tradition can preserve such information, why not in Egypt? Especially if that tradition was later committed to writing and carefully maintained by a literate priesthood. The date, in short, is not as crazy as it first appears. It places Atlantis at exactly the right moment for a climate catastrophe to have destroyed it, and it aligns with emerging evidence that humans were capable of more sophisticated cultural developments at that time than we previously imagined. The geography beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Now let us talk about where Atlantis was supposed to be, because this is where things get tricky. Plato tells us that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Spain and Morocco, where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic. He describes it as an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, and he says that from Atlantis, travelers could reach another continent on the far side of the ocean. This description has led to endless speculation. Some people take it literally and imagine a massive continent that once existed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They point to the mid-Atlantic ridge and wonder if it could have been above sea level. Others suggest Atlantis was in the Caribbean, or that it was Antarctica before it froze, or that Plato was actually describing the Americas. Here is the problem. Geologically, none of this works. Continents do not just sink into the ocean. The mid-Atlantic ridge is a spreading center, not a subduction zone. The ocean floor there is being created, not destroyed. There is no mechanism by which a continent could have existed in the Atlantic and then disappeared. So either Plato was wildly wrong about the location, or, and this is important, the geography has been garbled in transmission. Think about the chain we discussed. Egyptian priests to Solon, to Critias, to Plato. At each link, the story would have been translated, interpreted, filtered through different cultural frameworks. Geographic references could easily have been misunderstood or exaggerated. Beyond the Pillars of Heracles might simply mean in the Atlantic, as opposed to the Mediterranean. Larger than Libya and Asia combined might be an exaggeration, the kind of inflation that happens when stories are told and retold. The island might have been large and impressive, but not continent-sized. Some scholars have suggested Atlantis was actually somewhere in the Mediterranean. The most popular candidate is Thera, the volcanic island that exploded around 1600 BCE, devastating the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. The Minoan collapse could have been the historical kernel that grew into the Atlantis legend. The problem with this theory is the timeline. Plato specifically says 9,000 years, which would be around 9500 BCE. Thera erupted in 1600 BCE. That is a difference of almost 8,000 years. Could Plato have gotten the date that wrong? Maybe. Numbers in ancient texts are notoriously unreliable. Different cultures use different numbering systems. Errors in translation or transcription could inflate or deflate figures. Some researchers have suggested that the Egyptian number Plato heard might have meant months or seasons rather than years, which would bring the date much closer to the Minoan period. But this feels like special pleading. If we start arbitrarily changing the numbers to make the story fit our preferred theory, we are no longer investigating what Plato actually said. We are creating our own version of Atlantis. Here is what I think. The geography Plato describes does not match any real place we can identify. That much seems clear, but that does not necessarily mean the entire story is fiction. It might mean that the real location has been lost in translation, obscured by time and cultural filtering. What matters more than the specific location is the broader claim that a sophisticated civilization existed somewhere, was destroyed by a catastrophe involving water, flooding, earthquakes, maybe a tsunami, and that only legends and fragments survived. If we accept that core claim, then the question is not where exactly was Atlantis, but what was happening to coastal civilizations at the end of the Ice Age. Where would sea level rise have had the most devastating impact? What regions would have been most vulnerable? And the answer to those questions might surprise you, because at the end of the last Ice Age, when sea levels rose by 400 feet, huge swaths of prime coastal real estate disappeared. The North Sea was dry land. The Persian Gulf did not exist. Southeast Asia extended much farther than it does now. The continental shelves off India, Japan, the Americas, all of these were exposed and habitable. Those vanished coastlines are where we should be looking. Not for a continent in the Atlantic, but for the flooded landscapes where our ancestors actually lived. And increasingly, as underwater archaeology advances, that is exactly what we are finding. Now let us dive into what Plato actually tells us about Atlantis itself, because the description he provides is remarkably detailed, so detailed in fact that it either represents an elaborate act of world building by a master storyteller, or it preserves genuine information that came down to him through those Egyptian priests. I want you to picture yourself as Plato for a moment. You are writing a philosophical dialogue. Your goal is to illustrate ideas about ideal governance and the corruption of power. Do you really need to specify the exact dimensions of the city walls? Do you need to describe the precise layout of canals and harbors? Do you need to list the specific metals and resources available to the civilization? If you were just making up an allegory, probably not. You would sketch the broad outlines and move on to the philosophical points. But Plato does not do that. He gives us measurements. He describes architecture. He catalogs resources. He explains government structure and military organization. This is the behavior of someone working from a source, someone trying to preserve information they believe is important. So let us look at what he tells us. The capital city, a marvel of engineering, the heart of Atlantis, according to Plato, was its capital city, an engineering marvel built on a coastal plain near a mountain. The mountain itself was sacred, home to Poseidon, the god who supposedly founded the civilization. At the center of the city stood the royal palace, surrounded by rings of land and water. Think about this design for a moment. Concentric circles, alternating land and water. This is not a random layout. This is deliberate planning, probably with defensive purposes. The water rings would make the central island difficult to attack. You would need boats to cross each ring. Any invading force would be exposed and vulnerable, but it was not just about defense. Plato describes bridges connecting the rings and tunnels large enough for ships to pass through from the sea all the way to the innermost harbor. The outermost ring was lined with walls, and beyond that stretched the harbor, filled with ships and merchants from all over the known world. The central island, where the royal palace stood, was plated with precious metals. Plato mentions gold, silver, and something called Archaeological, a mysterious metal that he says glowed like fire and was found nowhere else. We do not know what Archaeological was. Some scholars think it might have been a copper alloy, possibly brass or bronze with an unusual luster. Others think it was purely mythological, but the fact that Plato specifies this detail, that he names a specific material, suggests he was working from a description that included it. The palace complex included a great temple to Poseidon, which Plato describes in detail, 600 feet long, 300 feet wide, with pinnacles of gold and a statue of the god standing in a chariot pulled by winged horses. The temple walls were covered in silver, the roof in ivory, and everything was decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum. Now, does this sound realistic for a civilization from 9500 BCE? Absolutely not. Hunter-gatherers did not build cities with concentric canals and temples covered in precious metals. They did not have the social organization, the surplus food production, or the metallurgical knowledge to create such structures. But here is where we need to be careful. Just because the description sounds impossible for the time period does not mean it is entirely fiction. It might be exaggerated. It might be misremembered. Details might have been added, over thousands of years of retelling. The core elements: a planned city with water management systems, impressive stone buildings, evidence of wealth and trade. Those could be real even if the golden roofs and silver walls are embellishments. Think about how oral traditions work. When you tell a story about a great city, you emphasize its greatness. You make the buildings taller, the wealth more impressive, the power more overwhelming. This is not lying. It is the nature of storytelling. The core truth remains. There was a great city, but the details get amplified. If Atlantis was real, what probably existed was an impressive coastal settlement, perhaps with stone buildings, systematic planning, water management, evidence of trade and craft specialization. By the time the story reached Plato, filtered through Egyptian tradition and Greek retelling, those real features had been transformed into golden temples and ships passing through mountain tunnels. The island, resources and agriculture. Beyond the capital, Plato describes the island of Atlantis itself as extraordinarily fertile and rich in resources. He says it produced 2 harvests per year, one watered by winter rains, another by irrigation from springs. The plain surrounding the capital was geometrically divided into lots, each assigned to a landholder who was responsible for providing soldiers and supplies. The island had mountains covered in forests, yielding timber for construction. It had mines that produced various metals. There were lakes, rivers, and meadows that supported both wild and domesticated animals. And here is a detail that has fascinated people for centuries. Plato specifically mentions elephants. Atlantis, he says, had elephants. Elephants in the Atlantic around 9500 BCE. This is either the smoking gun that proves the whole thing is fiction, or it is a tantalizing clue, because here is what we know. At the end of the Ice Age, there were elephants in many places we do not expect them today. Mammoths and mastodons roamed across North America, Europe, and Asia. Dwarf elephants lived on Mediterranean islands. The distribution of elephantine species was much wider than it is now. If Atlantis was in the Mediterranean or adjacent regions, say North Africa, before it became desert, elephants would not be impossible. In fact, Carthage, just across from Europe in Tunisia, was famous for its war elephants. Centuries later, the Romans encountered elephants in North Africa, so the presence of elephants, while unusual, is not absurd. What about the agricultural abundance? 2 harvests per year. This is actually not that extraordinary. Many regions with irrigation can support multiple growing seasons. Egypt itself was famous for its fertility, sustained by the Nile floods. Parts of Mesopotamia, India, China, all had agricultural systems that allowed multiple harvests. But the key detail here is irrigation. Plato specifically mentions irrigation from springs and canals. This implies hydraulic engineering, water management, organized agriculture. These are not the characteristics of a hunter-gatherer society. These are the marks of settled agricultural civilization. And here is where mainstream archaeology has been changing its tune. For decades, the assumption was that agriculture began around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, and that everything else, cities, writing, complex societies followed from that. But we keep finding evidence that complicates this narrative. We now know that people were cultivating plants and managing landscapes much earlier than we thought. The transition from foraging to farming was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual process that took thousands of years. Some societies had sophisticated resource management without full agriculture. Others had monumental architecture before farming. The point is, the picture is much more complex than the simple story we were taught, and that complexity opens space for the possibility that some societies, perhaps coastal societies that are now underwater, were more advanced than we expect for their time period. The military. A naval superpower, Plato describes Atlantis as a major military power, particularly at sea. The harbors, he says, were filled with ships and merchants. The navy was vast, and the Atlantean Empire controlled not just its home island, but territories beyond, parts of Libya, Europe, and other islands in the Atlantic. This is where the story takes on the character of an empire narrative, something more familiar from later history, from Persia, from Rome, from the great naval powers of the Mediterranean. And this is one reason many scholars think Plato was projecting contemporary politics backward, using Atlantis as a stand-in for Athens' rival Persia, or perhaps as a commentary on Athens' own imperial ambitions. But let us think about what naval power actually requires. You need ships, obviously. You need the ability to build and maintain them. You need navigation skills. You need trade networks to make the effort worthwhile. You need a population large enough to crew the vessels. You need resources to sustain the operation. Are these things impossible for a society at the end of the Ice Age? Actually, no. We know humans were seafaring far earlier than we once believed. People reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago, which required ocean voyages. By the end of the Ice Age, humans had spread to nearly every habitable part of the globe, including remote islands in the Pacific and the Americas. The technology for ocean travel existed, whether any society had organized it into a fleet, into a navy capable of conquest. That is a different question, but it is not absurd. What about the claim that Atlantis controlled an empire, that it had conquered territories across a wide area? This is harder to credit. Empire building requires not just military force, but administrative capacity, communication systems, resource extraction, cultural integration. These are characteristics of state-level societies, not prehistoric communities. But again, we need to consider exaggeration and distortion. What if the reality was more modest? What if Atlantis had trade networks, alliances, perhaps some degree of influence over neighboring regions? Over thousands of years of retelling, trade networks could become tribute systems, influence could become conquest, and a regional power could become a world-spanning empire. The pattern we keep seeing is this. The core claims might be plausible, while the scale and details are probably inflated. Strip away the exaggeration, and you might be left with something real. The destruction in a single day and night. And now we come to the end of the story, the part that, in many ways, is the most believable. According to Plato, Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods. The island sank beneath the sea. The people were swallowed by the waters, and the site became impassable, choked with mud and debris. For most of history, this was treated as the most fantastical part of the story. Islands do not just sink, people said. Catastrophes do not happen that fast. This has to be myth, exaggeration, the kind of divine punishment story that ancient cultures love to tell. But then we started learning about catastrophic events, about tsunamis that can cross an ocean in hours and devastate coastlines without warning, about volcanic eruptions that can bury entire cities in a day, about earthquakes that can drop land below sea level or trigger massive landslides. The Thera eruption around 1600 BCE is the obvious parallel. This was one of the largest volcanic explosions in human history. It may have generated tsunamis over 100 feet high. It buried the Minoan town of Akrotiri under volcanic ash, preserving it like a Bronze Age Pompeii. The effects were felt across the Mediterranean. Some researchers think it might have contributed to the fall of the Minoan civilization, and that destruction happened fast, within hours. In living memory, the island of Thera went from a thriving center to a shattered remnant, or consider more recent events. The 1908 Messina earthquake in Italy killed over 100,000 people and triggered a tsunami that destroyed coastal communities. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami killed over 200,000 people across multiple countries. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in Japan moved the coastline, destroyed entire towns, triggered a nuclear disaster. These catastrophes happen. They happen suddenly. They reshape coastlines. They erase communities from the map. And if you are a survivor trying to describe what happened, trying to explain how your world was destroyed overnight, your account would sound very much like Plato's description of Atlantis. But there is something even bigger going on at the end of the Ice Age, something that would have been far more devastating than any single earthquake or volcano. Sea level rise. When the glaciers melted, sea levels rose by 400 feet. That is not a sudden event. It happened over thousands of years, but it did not happen smoothly. There were pulses, periods when massive ice dams broke, releasing enormous volumes of water into the oceans. These meltwater pulses could raise sea levels by several feet in a matter of decades or even years. If you were living on a low-lying coastal plain, this would be catastrophic. Your homeland would be disappearing beneath the waves, slowly but inexorably. Your settlements would be flooded. Your fields would be inundated by salt water. You would be forced to retreat again and again, watching the sea claim more territory with each generation. And if one of those meltwater pulses coincided with a storm surge or an earthquake or a tsunami, the destruction could happen very quickly indeed, fast enough that it would live in memory as a single catastrophic event, even if the underlying cause was the slower process of sea level rise. This is the part of Plato's story that rings most true, not the golden temples or the elephants or the naval empire, but the destruction, the sudden overwhelming catastrophe that takes a thriving civilization and erases it from the earth, leaving only memories and refugees, because that is exactly what happened at the end of the Ice Age. The coastal world where humans had lived for thousands of years vanished beneath the waves. And if sophisticated societies existed on those coasts, and we are finding more evidence that they did, then their destruction would have been total. The Egyptian connection, keepers of ancient memory. Now we need to turn our attention to Egypt, because if there is any truth to the Atlantis story, if Plato was reporting something that came from genuine historical memory rather than pure invention, then the Egyptian priests would be the key to understanding it. Why Egypt? What made Egyptian civilization uniquely positioned to preserve ancient knowledge? The answer lies in continuity. The gift of the Nile, why Egypt endured. Think about what makes civilizations vulnerable: war, invasion, famine, drought, plague, natural disasters, political collapse. Any of these can destroy a society, scattering its people, burning its libraries, breaking the chain of cultural transmission. Egypt faced all of these at various points in its history, but it had a unique advantage: the Nile. The Nile is one of the most predictable river systems in the world. Every year, like clockwork, the river floods. The flood deposits nutrient-rich silt on the floodplain, making the land extraordinarily fertile. With minimal effort, Egyptian farmers could produce abundant harvests. Food security was rarely an issue. Beyond that, Egypt's geography provided natural defenses. Deserts to the east and west made invasion difficult. The Mediterranean to the north and the Nubian Desert to the south created barriers. While Egypt was not completely isolated, it traded with neighbors, was occasionally conquered. It was more protected than most ancient civilizations. This combination, reliable food production and relative isolation, meant that Egyptian civilization could persist for millennia. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign rulers occasionally took control, but the underlying structure of Egyptian society, the rhythms of life along the Nile, the basic patterns of culture and religion remained remarkably stable, and that stability meant knowledge could accumulate. The priests, in particular, served as guardians of tradition. They maintained temples, performed rituals, and preserved texts. They kept records of kings, of astronomical observations, of religious practices. They were the memory of the civilization. By the time Solon visited Egypt around 590 BCE, Egyptian civilization was already over 2,000 years old. The Great Pyramid had been standing for 2 millennia. The texts in the temple libraries went back centuries, and the oral traditions maintained by the priests might have reached back even further. The city of Ses and the temple of Ses was one of the oldest cities in Egypt, located in the western Nile Delta. During Solon's time, it was enjoying a period of particular prominence. The 26th dynasty, the Sate dynasty, had come to power, and these pharaohs were deliberately looking backward, trying to revive the glories of Egypt's old kingdom. This was a time of cultural renaissance. Egyptian art and architecture were consciously imitating earlier styles. There was a renewed interest in ancient texts and traditions. The priests at Sais were at the center of this revival, positioning themselves as custodians of Egypt's most ancient wisdom. The heart of Sais was the Temple of Neith, a goddess whose cult claimed immense antiquity. Neith was one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Some texts associate her with the very creation of the world. She was a goddess of war, of wisdom, of weaving and craft, and most intriguingly, of the primordial waters from which the world emerged. Think about that symbolism, a goddess associated with primordial waters, with creation, with the emergence of land from the deep. If you were a priest at this temple, maintaining traditions about ancient catastrophes, about floods that reshaped the world, about civilizations swallowed by rising seas, Neith would be the perfect deity to embody those memories. Unfortunately, we cannot verify this directly. The Temple of Neith at Sais was largely destroyed in later centuries. Most of its records are lost. We know about it primarily through Greek sources. Herodotus visited Sais and wrote about the temple, and Plato, of course, places his Atlantis story there. But the fact that Plato specifically chooses this location, this goddess, this time period for his story suggests he, or whoever his source was, knew something about what the priests at Sais claimed to preserve. They were known for maintaining ancient knowledge. They were associated with wisdom and deep time. If anyone in the ancient world could have preserved memories from the end of the Ice Age, it would have been them. Could they really remember that far back? Here is the question we have to confront. Is it actually possible for oral tradition to preserve information for 9,000 years or more? The conventional answer has been no. Oral traditions are unreliable, subject to distortion, prone to myth-making. Without writing to fix information in place, knowledge degrades quickly, or so the argument goes. But research over the past few decades has challenged this assumption. We now have multiple examples of oral traditions that have preserved accurate information over thousands of years. The most famous case comes from Aboriginal Australia. Researchers have found that Aboriginal oral traditions describe coastlines and geographic features as they existed during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. These traditions describe specific bays that are now underwater, islands that are now part of the mainland, land bridges that have been drowned. When you compare these oral accounts to geological data, they match. The traditions are accurately describing landscapes that existed 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The knowledge has been passed down through 300 to 400 generations without writing, maintained through song and story. Similar examples exist elsewhere. Native American traditions in the Pacific Northwest preserve detailed accounts of volcanic eruptions and tsunamis that can be correlated with geological evidence from thousands of years ago. Maori traditions in New Zealand accurately describe the arrival of their ancestors and the geography of islands they traveled from. The pattern is clear. When oral traditions are carefully maintained by specialists whose role is to preserve knowledge accurately, when they are embedded in ritual and performance, when they are considered sacred or essential to cultural identity, they can preserve factual information over extraordinary periods of time. Now, Egyptian priests were exactly this kind of specialist. Their role was to maintain tradition. They had institutional support. The temples provided resources and stability. They had writing to supplement oral tradition. They had religious motivation to preserve knowledge accurately. Is it possible they preserved traditions from the end of the Ice Age, from the period around 9500 BCE, when Plato says Atlantis was destroyed? Yes, it is not only possible, it is entirely consistent with what we know about how cultural memory works when it is institutionalized and protected. Now we need to talk about what was actually happening to the planet during the time period Plato describes. Because if Atlantis existed and was destroyed around 9500 BCE, as the story claims, then we need to understand the geological context. What forces were reshaping the world? What catastrophes were unfolding? And when we look at the evidence, we find something that should give everyone pause. We find that the period Plato describes, the end of the Younger Dryas, roughly 11,600 years ago, corresponds to one of the most dramatic climate upheavals in recent Earth history. The world was being destroyed and remade, and anyone living through it would have experienced something very much like what Plato describes: catastrophic flooding, the collapse of civilizations, the drowning of entire landscapes beneath rising seas, the end of the Ice Age, a world transformed. Let us start with the basics. For more than 100,000 years, Earth had been locked in an ice age. Massive ice sheets covered Canada, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. These glaciers were miles thick in places. The weight of all that ice depressed the Earth's crust beneath it. The climate was cold, dry, and harsh. But here is what is crucial. All that water locked up in ice had to come from somewhere, and where it came from was the ocean. Sea levels during the last glacial maximum, the coldest point around 20,000 years ago, were 300 to 400 feet lower than today. Think about what that means. The coastlines were completely different. The English Channel did not exist. Britain was connected to Europe. The North Sea was dry land with rivers and forests. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the surrounding islands were all connected to mainland Asia in a region called Sundaland. The Bering Strait between Alaska and Siberia was a land bridge. The continental shelves off every coast were exposed, and these coastal plains were not barren wastelands. They were prime habitat, mild climates, access to both marine and terrestrial resources, navigable rivers. These were the places where humans would naturally congregate, where cultures would develop, where, if any, advanced societies existed, they would build their cities. Then, starting around 19,000 years ago, the climate began to warm. The glaciers started melting, and that water had to go somewhere. It went back into the ocean. Sea levels began to rise. This was not a smooth process. It happened in pulses. Sometimes the rise was relatively slow. Other times, massive ice dams would break, releasing enormous volumes of water in catastrophic floods. These meltwater pulses could raise global sea levels by several meters in a matter of years or decades. Put yourself in the position of someone living on those coastal plains. Your homeland is disappearing. Every generation, the sea encroaches a little further. Your settlements are flooded. Your fields are inundated with salt water. You are forced to move inland, abandoning the places your ancestors have lived for thousands of years. And then, during one of those meltwater pulses, the destruction accelerates. What took generations suddenly happens in years. The world you know is drowned. This is not speculation. This is documented geology. Sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age is a fact. The question is not whether it happened, but what it destroyed. What civilizations, if any, were lost beneath those rising waves? The Younger Dryas, the Big Freeze. But the story of sea level rise is complicated by something even stranger, because the warming at the end of the Ice Age was not steady. Around 12,800 years ago, something happened, something that caused temperatures to plunge back toward glacial conditions almost overnight. This period is called the Younger Dryas, named after a cold-adapted Arctic wildflower called Dryas octopetala. When paleoclimatologists examined pollen records from lake sediments and peat bogs, they found that Dryas pollen suddenly became abundant around 12,800 years ago. This indicated a return to cold, tundra-like conditions after the climate had been warming for several thousand years. The Younger Dryas lasted about 1,200 years, from roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. During this period, temperatures dropped dramatically by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. The warming trend that had characterized the end of the Ice Age was interrupted, reversed, thrown into chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the Younger Dryas ended. Around 11,600 years ago, temperatures shot back up. Ice core data from Greenland shows temperature increases of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in as little as a decade, maybe even faster. Some researchers think the shift could have happened in just a few years. Let me say that again. The world's climate may have changed by 15 degrees in less than 10 years. For humans living through this, it would have been apocalyptic. Imagine your world completely transforming within a single lifetime. The glaciers surge, then retreat. Coastlines shift dramatically. Weather patterns change. Plant and animal distributions shift. Food sources disappear or move. Everything you know about how to survive in your environment becomes obsolete. And here is the thing that makes all of this relevant to Atlantis, the end of the Younger Dryas, that moment around 11,600 years ago when temperatures suddenly shot up, corresponds almost exactly to Plato's date for the destruction of Atlantis. Plato says 9500 BCE. The end of the Younger Dryas is approximately 9600 BCE. We are talking about the same time period. Coincidence? You tell me. What caused the Younger Dryas? The question that has puzzled scientists for decades is, what triggered the Younger Dryas? What could have caused such a dramatic climate reversal? The leading explanation for many years has been the meltwater hypothesis. The idea is that as the Laurentide ice sheet, that massive glacier covering much of North America, melted, it released enormous volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic Ocean. This fresh water disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the ocean conveyor belt that redistributes heat around the planet. Here is how it works. Warm, salty water from the tropics flows north along the surface of the Atlantic. When it reaches the North Atlantic, it cools and becomes denser. Because it is salty, it is heavy enough to sink to the ocean floor. This sinking water drives a deep current that flows back south, completing the circulation loop. This system, called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, is crucial for moderating global climate. It brings warmth to northern Europe and influences weather patterns worldwide. But if you dump massive amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic, you dilute the salt water. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, so it does not sink as readily. If enough fresh water floods in, it can shut down the circulation entirely. Without the conveyor belt bringing warm water north, temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummet. This is not just theory. We have evidence that something like this happened. Geological studies show that enormous lakes formed along the edge of the melting ice sheet. These glacial lakes, some as large as the Great Lakes or even larger, were dammed by ice. When the ice dams broke, catastrophic floods would release staggering volumes of water into the ocean. The scab lands of eastern Washington state preserve the scars of these floods. The landscape there is carved with enormous channels, giant ripple marks, and other features that could only have been created by floods of unimaginable scale. Geologists estimate that some of these floods involved water flows 10 times greater than all the rivers in the world combined. The water was moving so fast it carved through solid bedrock. So the meltwater hypothesis has real evidence behind it. It makes sense. It fits the data. For decades, it was the accepted explanation. But then, in 2007, a team of researchers proposed something different, something more dramatic, something that, if true, would make the Atlantis story seem far less fantastical. The Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis, a comet from the sky, Richard Firestone and his colleagues suggested that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic impact. They proposed that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid, or more likely, multiple fragments from a larger object that had broken up, struck the Earth. The evidence they pointed to was intriguing. At sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, they found a distinct layer in the sediment dating to the start of the Younger Dryas. This layer contained unusual materials, elevated levels of iridium, platinum, and other elements that are rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets. It contained nanodiamonds, tiny carbon structures that form under extreme pressure and temperature. It contained magnetic spherules, tiny particles of iron that had been melted and then cooled. It contained charcoal and soot, evidence of massive wildfires. All of these materials, they argued, are consistent with an impact event. The impactor would have been a comet, composed largely of ice, which is why no crater has been found. Impacts on the ice sheet would have left little trace. The explosion would have been similar to the Tunguska event in 1908, when an asteroid or comet exploded over Siberia, flattening trees across 2,000 square kilometers but leaving no crater. But the Younger Dryas impact would have been much, much larger. The hypothesis suggests multiple impacts across North America and possibly Europe. The fireballs would have triggered continent-wide wildfires. The heat and shock waves would have melted huge sections of the ice sheet, releasing catastrophic floods. The debris thrown into the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight, causing rapid cooling. The disruption to ocean circulation would have sustained that cooling for centuries. If this happened, and I want to be clear that the scientific community is still deeply divided on whether it did, it would have been the most catastrophic event humans had experienced since our species evolved. Picture it: multiple impacts, possibly within hours or days, fireballs streaking across the sky, explosions visible from thousands of miles away, continent-scale fires, the ice sheet collapsing, releasing floods that would dwarf anything in historical memory, ash and debris darkening the sky, a climate crisis that would last for over 1,000 years. Any civilizations that existed would have been devastated, not just by the immediate impacts, but by the cascade of consequences. Food systems would collapse, trade networks would break down, populations would crash, survivors would be thrown back to subsistence living, struggling just to stay alive. And if they did survive, if they managed to pass down memories of what happened, what would those stories sound like? They would sound like myths of divine punishment, of gods hurling fire from heaven, of floods destroying the world, of a golden age before the catastrophe, when people lived in great cities and possessed knowledge that was later lost. They would sound, in other words, very much like the Atlantis story. The scientific debate. I need to be honest with you about the state of the science here. The impact hypothesis is controversial. Many researchers remain skeptical. Critics have argued that the supposed impact markers could have other explanations. They point out that no definitive crater has been found. They note that the evidence is not consistent across all sites. In recent years, the debate has intensified. Some studies have claimed to replicate the findings, finding impact markers at additional sites. Others have failed to find the expected signatures. A possible crater, the Hiawatha crater beneath Greenland's ice sheet, was discovered, but its age is still being debated. Some researchers think it could be from the Younger Dryas impact. Others think it is much older or much younger. The honest assessment is this: we do not know for certain what triggered the Younger Dryas. The impact hypothesis is one possibility. The meltwater hypothesis is another. There could be other factors we have not considered, or it could be some combination. Maybe meltwater flooding was the primary cause, but an impact event made it worse. What we do know, beyond any doubt, is that something dramatic happened. The climate changed rapidly. Ecosystems collapsed. Megafauna went extinct. Human populations were severely affected. And this all happened right around the time Plato says Atlantis was destroyed. Whether it was an impact, a flood, or some other catastrophe, the result would have been the same. Any coastal civilizations that existed would have been in serious trouble. Archaeological evidence, traces of the lost world. So we have the geological context. We know that catastrophic events were happening at the end of the Ice Age. We know that sea levels rose dramatically, drowning coastlines where humans had lived for millennia. We know that the climate went through violent upheavals. The question now becomes, what archaeological evidence do we have? If sophisticated societies existed before the floods, what traces have they left behind? This is where things get fascinating, because we are finding more and more evidence that our ancestors were capable of far more than we once believed. Göbekli Tepe, the site that changed everything. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. The name means Potbelly Hill in Turkish, a reference to its rounded shape. Local shepherds had known for years that there was something odd about the place. Stones jutting from the ground at unusual angles, carved with strange figures. Schmidt dug a test trench. What he found would revolutionize our understanding of prehistoric humanity. Göbekli Tepe is a massive stone complex covering about 22 acres. It consists of multiple circular enclosures, each defined by enormous T-shaped limestone pillars. The pillars weigh between 5 and 20 tons. They are elaborately carved with images of animals: lions, foxes, scorpions, snakes, birds. Some pillars feature anthropomorphic figures, stylized humans with arms and hands. The largest pillars are about 18 feet tall. They were quarried from bedrock, transported to the site, shaped with precision, and erected in careful arrangements. The enclosures are connected by walls, organized into complex architectural patterns. And here is the part that should blow your mind. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9600 BCE, 11,600 years ago, roughly the same time as Plato's Atlantis. This was not supposed to be possible. At that time, according to everything we thought we knew, humans were living as hunter-gatherers. They had no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no complex social hierarchies. They certainly did not have the organization, the surplus food production, or the technical knowledge to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton stone pillars, but they did. Göbekli Tepe proves they did. What is even more remarkable is that the site appears to have been a ritual center, not a settlement. There are no houses, no trash heaps, no signs that people lived there permanently. Instead, it seems to have been a place where different groups gathered for ceremonies or celebrations. This implies a level of social organization that we did not think existed at this time. The ability to coordinate labor from multiple communities, to plan and execute a massive construction project, to maintain a shared sacred space. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Archaeologists have found similar sites in the region, all dating to the same general period. This suggests a widespread culture with shared religious or symbolic traditions, capable of monumental architecture thousands of years before we thought such things were possible. The implications are staggering. If hunter-gatherers in Anatolia could build Göbekli Tepe, what were coastal peoples capable of? What structures might have been built on those now drowned continental shelves? And if such structures existed, would we even recognize them after 11,000 years underwater? Underwater archaeology, searching beneath the waves. This brings us to the most direct search for Atlantis-type civilizations, underwater archaeology, because if advanced societies existed on the coasts at the end of the Ice Age, the evidence would now be hundreds of feet underwater, scattered across continental shelves that we have barely begun to explore. Underwater archaeology is challenging and expensive. You need specialized equipment, trained divers or submarines, sophisticated sonar and imaging technology. The visibility is often poor. Sites can be covered by sediment or colonized by marine life. Preservation is variable. Organic materials usually do not survive, but stone and ceramics can last for millennia. Despite these challenges, we have found numerous submerged sites around the world. Most date to relatively recent periods: Bronze Age ports, Roman harbors, medieval settlements that sank due to subsidence or erosion, but a few are older, much older. Atlit Yam, a Neolithic village beneath the Mediterranean. Off the coast of Israel, about 30 feet underwater, lies Atlit Yam. This is a Neolithic village that was occupied between 6900 and 6200 BCE. It is remarkably well preserved, with stone houses, a water well lined with stones, paved areas, and numerous artifacts, including stone tools, animal bones, and human remains. The most striking feature of Atlit Yam is a semicircle of standing stones about 10 feet tall, arranged around a freshwater spring. This is clearly a ritual or ceremonial structure, suggesting that the people of Atlit Yam had complex religious or social practices. The site was probably submerged by rising sea levels combined with tectonic subsidence. The fact that it is so well preserved that we can see houses and wells and ritual structures shows that underwater sites can survive for thousands of years if conditions are right. Now, Atlit Yam is not old enough to be connected to Atlantis, but it demonstrates something important. Significant settlements existed on ancient coastlines, and some of them are now underwater. If there are well-preserved 7,000-year-old sites, why not 11,000-year-old sites? The technology to find them is still developing, and we have explored only a tiny fraction of the world's continental shelves. Off the southern coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, lies what may be the most controversial underwater formation in the world. Discovered in 1986 by a local dive operator named Kihachiro Arataki, the Yonaguni Monument consists of massive stone structures with flat surfaces, sharp edges, right angles, and what appear to be terraces, steps, and platforms. The question that has divided researchers for decades is deceptively simple. Is it natural or man-made? Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist who has spent years studying the site, argues passionately that it is artificial. He points to features that seem too regular, too intentional to be natural: right-angle corners, flat terraces arranged in steps, channels that look like they were carved, holes that appear to be post holes for wooden structures. He has identified what he interprets as a castle-like structure, a ziggurat, roads, and even what might be carved animal figures. Kimura argues that if the monument is artificial, it must be at least 10,000 years old, because that is when the area was last above sea level. This would make it older than any known civilization, contemporary with the end of the Ice Age, and here is that date again, roughly the same period as Plato's Atlantis. Skeptics, however, are not convinced. Geologist Robert Schoch, who supports alternative theories about other sites, examined Yonaguni and concluded it is primarily natural. The sandstone in that region naturally fractures along horizontal and vertical planes due to geological stress. This can produce flat surfaces and right angles without any human intervention. Schoch notes that there are similar formations on nearby land that are clearly natural, and no definitive evidence of tool marks or quarrying has been found at the underwater site. The debate remains unresolved. Some researchers think it might be a natural formation that humans modified, adding steps, platforms, or carvings to an existing rock structure. Others think it is entirely natural, and humans are seeing patterns where none exist, a form of pareidolia applied to geology. What is undeniable is this: Yonaguni captures the essential problem we face when searching for evidence of ancient civilizations. After 10,000 years, especially underwater, what would we even recognize as artificial? How much would erosion, marine growth, and natural processes obscure human handiwork? And if we cannot agree on a site as accessible and well studied as Yonaguni, how will we ever definitively identify ruins from the end of the Ice Age? Flood myths, the universal memory. Let us turn now to another form of evidence: stories, because while physical archaeology can be ambiguous and incomplete, the myths and legends preserved by cultures around the world tell a remarkably consistent tale. Nearly every ancient culture has a flood myth, a story about how the world was destroyed by water, how humanity was nearly wiped out, how only a few survivors remained to rebuild civilization. The details vary, but the core narrative is strikingly similar across continents and millennia. This is either the most remarkable coincidence in human history, or it is evidence of something real, a genuine catastrophe that affected people worldwide and was preserved in cultural memory. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the Biblical Flood. The most famous flood myth in Western tradition is the story of Noah's Ark from the Hebrew Bible. God decides to destroy humanity because of its wickedness. He instructs Noah to build an ark and save his family, plus representatives of every animal species. The flood comes, covering the earth, killing everything. After the waters recede, Noah's family repopulates the world. What many people do not realize is that this story is not unique to the Bible. It appears much earlier in Mesopotamian literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Akkadian around 1800 BCE, includes a flood story that is remarkably similar. In this version, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. One god warns a man named Utnapishtim, who builds a boat, saves his family and animals. and survives the deluge. After 7 days, the waters recede, and Utnapishtim makes offerings to the gods. Even earlier versions exist. The Sumerian Eridugenesis, dating to around 2100 BCE, tells a similar story about a king named Ziusudra who survives a flood sent by the gods. The pattern is clear. These stories are part of a shared Mesopotamian tradition that predates the Hebrew Bible by centuries or millennia. Now, skeptics point out that flooding was common in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly, sometimes catastrophically. The flood myths, they argue, are just cultural memories of particularly bad flood seasons, exaggerated over time into tales of world destruction. This is plausible for Mesopotamian stories, but it does not explain why similar flood myths appear in cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia and no reason to fear river floods. Flood myths around the world. Hindu tradition preserves the story of Manu, the first man who was warned by a fish about an impending flood. Manu builds a boat, survives the deluge, and becomes the progenitor of the human race. This story appears in texts like the Shatapatha Brahmana, dating to around 800 BCE or earlier. Greek mythology includes the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood. Deucalion, warned by his father Prometheus, builds an ark. After 9 days, the waters recede, and Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth by throwing stones that become people. In China, the legend of Gunyu describes a great flood that lasts for generations. The hero, Yu, organizes massive engineering projects to control the waters, eventually succeeding and founding the Jia dynasty. Mesoamerican cultures have flood myths too. The Aztecs believed the world had been destroyed and recreated multiple times, with one cycle ending in a great flood. The Maya Popol Vuh describes the gods destroying an earlier race of humans with a flood. Native American tribes across North America preserve flood stories. The Ojibwe speak of Nanabojo rebuilding the earth after a flood. The Hopi describe emergence into this world from a previous one destroyed by water. The Lenape tell of a great flood that covered the mountains. Australian Aboriginal traditions include flood stories describing how the ancestral landscape was transformed when the seas rose. Some of these stories can be correlated with specific geographic features that were inundated at the end of the Ice Age. The pattern is global. From every inhabited continent, from cultures separated by oceans and millennia, we have stories about catastrophic floods that destroyed an earlier world. What do the flood myths mean? There are two main ways to interpret this pattern. The skeptical view is that floods are common, memorable, and traumatic. Every culture experiences them, so every culture develops myths about them. The similarities are not evidence of a shared historical event, but of universal human psychology. We all fear drowning. We all anthropomorphize natural forces. We all create stories that make sense of disaster. The alternative view is that these myths preserve genuine historical memory. That at the end of the Ice Age, when sea levels rose by 400 feet, coastal peoples worldwide experienced catastrophic flooding. These events were so traumatic, so transformative, that they were passed down through generations, eventually becoming the mythological frameworks we recognize today. Which interpretation is correct? Probably both contain elements of truth. Yes, humans naturally create flood myths because floods are universal disasters. But yes, there was also a real global event, the meltwater pulses at the end of the Ice Age, that would have affected coastal communities everywhere. The myths might blend real memory with psychological universals, making it impossible to separate the two completely. What is clear is this: the idea that the world was once different, that it was destroyed by water, that earlier peoples possessed knowledge that was lost. This idea is not unique to Plato. It is not even unique to the Mediterranean. It is a human story, told and retold across every culture that has survived long enough to remember. And that makes Atlantis less of an anomaly and more of a pattern. Plato's story fits into a much larger tapestry of human memory about catastrophe and loss. Alternative theories and modern explorations. Before we conclude, we need to address the elephant in the room: the alternative researchers, the people who argue most vocally for the reality of Atlantis and other lost civilizations. Figures like Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, and others who occupy an uncomfortable space between mainstream archaeology and fringe speculation. Mainstream academics often dismiss these researchers entirely, treating them as pseudoscientists peddling fantasy to credulous audiences. But this dismissal misses something important. Some of their questions are legitimate, even if their answers are not always convincing. Graham Hancock and the Quest for Lost Civilizations. Graham Hancock is probably the most famous modern advocate for the idea that advanced civilizations existed before recorded history. His core thesis, laid out in books like Fingerprints of the Gods and Magicians of the Gods, is that a sophisticated maritime civilization existed during the last ice age. This civilization was largely destroyed by the catastrophes at the end of the Younger Dryas. Survivors spread across the world, bringing their knowledge to less advanced peoples, jump-starting the known ancient civilizations. Hancock points to various pieces of evidence: the advanced astronomy encoded in ancient structures like the pyramids, the similarities between megalithic architecture on different continents, the precision of stoneworking at sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia, the existence of anomalous maps like the Piri Reis chart that seem to show Antarctica without ice, the global distribution of flood myths, and the sudden appearance of agriculture and complex societies in multiple regions around 10,000 years ago. The mainstream response has been harsh. Archaeologists point out that Hancock cherry-picks evidence, ignores context, misunderstands dating methods, and makes connections that are not supported by the data. They note that agriculture did not appear suddenly. It developed gradually over thousands of years. They argue that similarities between ancient cultures can be explained by convergent evolution and human universals, not by a lost mother civilization. And in many cases, the critics are right. Hancock does overstate his case. He does make leaps that the evidence does not support. He does sometimes rely on outdated or questionable sources, but, and this is important, He also asks questions that mainstream archaeology has been too quick to dismiss. The precision of ancient stoneworking really is remarkable. The astronomical alignments really are sophisticated. The sudden flourishing of civilization in multiple regions really does need better explanation, and the possibility that we are missing something, that sea level rise has hidden chapters of human history, is not crazy. The problem with Hancock is not that he is asking questions. The problem is that he is too certain of his answers. A more measured approach, acknowledging the mysteries, proposing hypotheses, but remaining open to being wrong, would serve the investigation better. Robert Schoch and the Age of the Sphinx. Robert Schoch is a geologist who became famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, for arguing that the Sphinx is much older than mainstream Egyptology claims. His argument is based on weathering patterns. The body of the Sphinx shows deep vertical erosion that he argues could only have been caused by heavy rainfall over an extended period, but Egypt has been arid for thousands of years. The last time the region experienced the kind of rainfall that could produce such erosion was during the early Holocene, roughly 7,000 to 5,000 BCE, or possibly even earlier. If Schoch is right, the Sphinx predates the 4th dynasty of Egypt by thousands of years. It would make it contemporary with, or even older than, the period Plato describes for Atlantis. Egyptologists have pushed back hard. They point to stylistic elements that match 4th dynasty art. They argue that groundwater seepage, not rainfall, could have caused the erosion. They note that the Sphinx is never mentioned in texts older than the New Kingdom, which would be strange if it had been standing for millennia before the pyramids. The debate continues. What is interesting is that Schoch, unlike Hancock, is working within his area of expertise. He is a geologist, analyzing geological evidence. His interpretation may be wrong, but it is not pseudoscience. It is a legitimate scientific disagreement about how to interpret weathering patterns. And if he is right, even partially right, it would force us to radically rethink the timeline of Egyptian civilization. It would open space for the possibility that sophisticated cultures existed in the region much earlier than we thought. Conclusion: the mystery endures so. After all of this, after examining Plato's text, after looking at Egyptian records, after diving into the geology of the Younger Dryas, after surveying underwater ruins and flood myths and alternative theories, where does that leave us? The honest answer is, we do not know. And maybe that is exactly where we should be. Did Atlantis exist exactly as Plato described it? Almost certainly not. The geography does not work. The scale seems exaggerated. The story has clearly been filtered through multiple layers of interpretation and cultural translation. The golden temples and silver walls and mysterious orichalcum are probably embellishments added over millennia of retelling. But is there something real behind the legend? A catastrophic event at the end of the Ice Age that destroyed coastal civilizations and left only fragments and memories? That is starting to look more plausible than it once did. We know the climate changed dramatically around 11,600 years ago. We know sea levels rose by 400 feet, drowning vast stretches of coastline. We know that sophisticated cultures like the builders of Göbekli Tepe existed far earlier than we once thought possible. We know that flood myths are ubiquitous across human cultures. We know that underwater archaeology keeps finding older and older submerged structures. We know that oral traditions can preserve accurate information for 10,000 years or more. All of this suggests that our conventional narrative of human history, the tidy progression from primitive hunter-gatherers to advanced civilizations starting around 5,000 years ago, is incomplete. We are missing chapters. Entire periods of human development may have been lost when the seas rose. Does this mean Graham Hancock is right about everything? Does it validate every alternative theory about ancient, advanced civilizations? No. Many of those theories go way beyond what the evidence actually supports. The leap from "we are missing something" to "there was a globe-spanning, advanced civilization with technology we do not understand" is not justified by the data. But it does mean we should keep an open mind. We should keep looking. We should keep questioning. We should resist the temptation to dismiss ideas just because they challenge the established narrative, because here is what I find most compelling about the Atlantis story. It refuses to die. For 2,300 years, despite being dismissed by most academics, despite the lack of definitive proof, despite all the crackpot theories and pseudo-archaeological nonsense that have attached themselves to it, the story persists. And it persists not just because people want to believe in lost civilizations, but because something about it rings true. It rings true because we know the catastrophe is real. We know that civilizations can fall. We know that knowledge can be lost. We live in a time when climate change threatens our coastal cities, when rising seas could displace hundreds of millions of people, when we can easily imagine a future where our own civilization might be reduced to ruins and legends. Maybe that is why Atlantis matters. Not because it answers questions about the past, but because it forces us to ask questions about the future, about resilience and fragility, about what endures and what is lost, about how we will be remembered if we fail to meet the challenges of our own time. The search for Atlantis continues. New technology, satellite imaging, underwater robotics, genetic analysis, ice core studies keeps revealing more about the end of the Ice Age. More underwater sites are being discovered. More anomalies in the archaeological record are being investigated. And with each new finding, the picture becomes a little clearer and a little more complicated. Will we ever find definitive proof? Maybe not. The ocean is vast, and we have explored only a tiny fraction of its depths. The underwater sites that do exist are often so degraded by time that it is hard to distinguish artificial structures from natural formations. And even if we found a sunken city dating to the right period, we could never prove it was the Atlantis Plato described. It would just be one of many lost cities from that catastrophic time. But perhaps that is okay. Perhaps the value of Atlantis is not in finding it, but in looking for it, in staying curious, in refusing to accept easy answers, in recognizing that history is deeper and stranger than we can imagine. Plato wrote about Atlantis in the context of discussing the ideal state, the perfect society. He wanted to explore what makes civilizations thrive and what causes them to fall. In that sense, Atlantis was always meant to be a mirror, a way of looking at ourselves. And when we look into that mirror, what do we see? We see a species capable of extraordinary achievement and catastrophic failure. We see the potential for wisdom and the reality of hubris. We see the fragility of everything we build and the persistence of memory long after the buildings have fallen. That is the real legacy of Atlantis, not a lost continent, not proof of ancient super technology, not validation for every fringe theory, but a reminder that we are always closer to catastrophe than we think, and that the difference between civilization and oblivion can be measured in the span of a single lifetime. The mystery endures, the ocean keeps its secrets, and somewhere in the deep places where light does not reach, perhaps the ruins of forgotten cities rest undisturbed, waiting for the day when we are ready to understand what they have to teach us. Until then, we keep searching, we keep asking questions, we keep the story alive, because that, in the end, is what stories do. They survive when cities fall. They cross oceans when empires crumble. They preserve truth even when all other evidence is lost. And maybe, just maybe, the story of Atlantis has survived for so long because somewhere deep in our collective memory, we know it is true. Not true in the literal sense of every detail matching historical fact, but true in the deeper sense that matters. True as a warning about hubris, true as a reminder of fragility, true as evidence that we have lost more than we remember, true as a mirror showing us what we might become if we are not careful. The waters rose once before. They drowned the world our ancestors knew. They swallowed cities and coastlines and entire landscapes. They erased chapters of human history that we are only now beginning to glimpse in fragments. And the waters are rising again. That is why Atlantis will not go away. That is why every generation rediscovers the story and makes it their own. Because we need the warning. We need the reminder. We need to understand that what happened once can happen again, that the civilizations we build can fall, that the knowledge we accumulate can be lost. So whether Atlantis was a real place or a powerful metaphor, whether it lies beneath the waves waiting to be found or exists only in the realm of myth and memory, the story matters. It has always mattered. And as long as humans build cities on coasts and believe they are permanent, it will continue to matter. The search is not over. The questions are not answered. The mystery endures. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be.